Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Thrive Co-Living Communities YouTube podcast. I'm Mark Stein, Thrive founder and your podcast host. We're creating sustainable, inclusive, and multi-generational residential communities. Our mission is to combat the epidemic of isolation, revitalize communities, and help others discover the many benefits of engaged community living by offering unique and ecologically sustainable co-living options. In this podcast series, join us as we discuss co-living, in addition to bringing you interesting people from around the world who are doing cool things to expand your knowledge and satisfy your curiosity. Through this podcast, learn more about our concept and see how Thrive co-living communities will bring together people from all walks of life who want to enjoy the best of independent and group living. To find out more about us, please visit our website at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. Thanks for watching and enjoy the podcast. Okay, hi everybody, and welcome back to the Thrive Co-Living Communities podcast. I'm your host, Mark Stein, and I'm excited to welcome back my guest, Dr. Penny Clark. We'll try to figure out how long ago it was. It might have been pre-COVID that we last spoke, but she's the Director of Research and Sustainability at Conscious Coliving. In her role there, she conducts research and consults on shared living projects. She's passionate about the potential for co-living and here today to talk more about the state of co-living, new co-living trends, what COVID did to co-living, and much more. So welcome back to the Thrive Co-Living Communities podcast. Penny, glad to have you back. Glad to see you.
Yeah, great to be back on. Thanks, Mark.
So let me, if you are doing a public presentation, standing up in front of an audience and you forgot your belt, the only way you're going to be comfortable is to say, I forgot my belt. So let me go ahead and talk about my elephant in my room here. I am not usually this red. It's my lighting, and something is creating some weird shadowing going on on this shoulder. So now that I've said it, I can ignore it, and hopefully you guys will be able to as well. Let's see if this helps. Nope. Something about the lighting. So Penny, tell us a little more about your background that you'd like to share, and then let us know what you've been doing lately.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. I think the introduction was pretty good, but a little bit more about my background. So I'm a social scientist by training, and my segue into the co-living sector was when I did my PhD, which was looking at types of shared living and environmental sustainability. So looking at, if you're living together, you're sharing resources, in what ways can this lower your environmental impact, and how does that happen? And I think all those years ago, probably the first time I came onto your show, I probably talked quite a lot about my research. So since finishing that, as much as I can, I've tried to still engage in research relating to the shared living sector. And I think a couple of projects worth mentioning are, in the past year or two, I've been an editor and contributor to two books which specialize in communal living. So one on urban communities in Britain, and then one on co-housing in Britain as well. As much as I can, although I engage in consultancy and love the practicality of that work, I try and stick with the research as much as I can too.
Is that where your heart is?
I think
research.
What is. I think it's just, I find it so exciting to say I don't know when it comes to topics, and then to go and get to find out, to try and find out and try and understand the things that I don't know. And I also think, shared living, forms of communal living, whether that's co-living, co-housing, communes, it's still so niche and there's so little known about it. And there's probably quite a lot of misconceptions as well. And so, as well as the research, or sort of part and parcel of that, for me, it's about advocacy too. So, looking at the clear benefits that come from different types of shared living, and then pointing that out to people as much as I can.
Mm-hmm. So what do you perceive that COVID did to, there was definitely some momentum building prior to COVID, and it seemed continuous. There was the not-for-profit, and remind me, not the membership organization, what,
Okay.
Co-Live. That was growing, membership was growing. There were a lot of programming. There was a lot of programming around it. Then COVID hit. Describe as best as you can what happened. Did it go almost to zero? What happened
Mhm. Yeah,
then?
I think COVID was a bit of a watershed moment for co-living. So we had the kind of very immediate effect when in many countries across the world we had lockdowns. And in that sense, for co-living businesses, in that immediate sense, there were winners and losers. So, for example, if you had co-living where quite a large proportion of your residents were students, university or college, as you would say in the US, courses got cancelled. So lots of those students immediately left, and suddenly some businesses were left quite empty, and suffered as a result. There were some co-living businesses where residents weren't necessarily students, but maybe they were international, or maybe, the people who lived there just felt safer going back home, maybe to their parents' house or to a relative's house. And so certainly at the beginning, some businesses faced a little bit of an exodus. But having said that, once you got beyond that initial people leaving, co-living, I think, actually did pretty well, because for those who decided to stay, they suddenly found themselves in probably a much better situation than many people who live just with their nuclear family or live by themselves did, because they were still able to live with friends and socialize. They had things going on in their building, as opposed to, I live with my partner during the pandemic, and things were very quiet and I didn't have a lot to do. This was not the case if you're living with, 30 to 100 other roommates. And also because of the nature of co-living and that it's managed, people also had, management kind of looking out for them and helping with their well-being and doing what they could. So I think provided that you're not someone who has certain health vulnerabilities and, was much more cautious about contracting COVID, I think for a lot of people, it was actually a really good experience living in COVID. Um, and that's talking like the immediate effect and actually during COVID. Beyond that, I do think COVID and its after effects have actually increased the case for co-living, because now we're in a situation where it's pretty normal to work from home, at least some of the time. So suddenly having a space where you have a co-working space, where you have outdoor space, where you have more going on in your home, that's quite fitting with that kind of ethos that comes with working from home more. So in a sense, co-living kind of sort of presciently set up that environment that actually emphasizes the local and emphasizes things going on where you live. So I don't think COVID has had a bad impact on co-living at all. If anything, probably it's been the opposite in my view.
Let me ask you a couple follow-up questions. So if there were people who stayed, then I would imagine that the operators locked everybody down and restricted, because as long as people were sheltering in place and staying put, then everybody's going to be safe. But if there are people that had to go out and come back in, then that put the whole community at risk. Do you remember hearing about serious um, uh, efforts to keep people in, and then if people had to go out for work or whatever, then they were ejected from the co-living space?
I mean, it was a few years ago now, but from what I remember talking to operators, um, their strategies for managing COVID and COVID safety varied a bit. So I don't think anybody said to residents, you can't go out, because some residents had to work. It was just their jobs. I think some operators did shut down communal areas or did implement kind of safety procedures for communal areas, like very in-depth cleaning happening, or kind of putting in, signs to persuade people to stay a certain distance apart, for example. And for some residents, I think they ended up having to stay in their rooms, and then the co-living operators would kind of set up online events to help them beat, the feelings of isolation that they might have because they don't have access to their communal areas. So I think it varied a bit. And also, from country to country, lockdown rules differed as well. And
Right.
so probably I think operators were taking their lead somewhat from national rules and interpreting those as best as they could.
Mm-hmm. I'm finding in my area, and I'm in Tampa Bay, is that the effect, or the people got into habits of staying closer to home and not going out. And I'm finding today still challenges to get people to go out. It's we've got more streaming video.
Mm.
People have bigger and bigger TVs. Um, and I think people are pretty much conditioned to stay close to home, and especially seniors.
Mm.
And there are a lot of seniors in my community, and I'll talk more about it later, but I'm seeing that there's sort of a hangover effect
Mm.
of um, staying close to home, and the loneliness that led us to embrace this movement um, is still there, and maybe even to a greater extent because technology keeps moving forward, and those trends of less religious participation, less civic participation, those trends are continuing. So I'm still seeing the underlying impetus that led many of us to embrace co-living. Uh,
Mm.
what are your thoughts around that? What are your experiences around that?
Yeah, I do agree. I think one thing that COVID made really clear as well is that it it really clearly made that link for people between socializing and mental health, having good mental health. And I think before that, that link was certainly there, but it was more like you might talk about that in a policy context or as a researcher, but really going through COVID, I think everybody became really aware of it. And yeah, as as you've talked about, I do think that um, that those years of isolation, years for some people, have probably had a really lasting impact, and we probably don't fully understand what that impact is at this point. Um, but certainly, yeah, it's shown us how important it is to have that contact and connection with other people. Um, and also, yeah, habit forming as well. You spend enough time indoors by yourself. I relate to it myself. I didn't really enjoy it. I didn't enjoy being isolated from others, but I did get comfortable, and I did have to get out of my comfort zone when I started socializing again. So I relate to that too.
Mhm. I'm an introvert, a pretty strong introvert. I can do what I need to do out in public, but I was one of the few people that I talked to who was not really impacted negatively by COVID. I worked at home before COVID, during, and still afterwards. And if I have 3 or 4 Zoom calls during the day, especially good conversations, that's all the socializing I really need. So, other than the pain and suffering around me, I was really happy as a clam, and I did not advertise it very often. There's nothing I enjoy doing in crowds of people. I was still able to, I live close to the beach. I was still able to walk on the beach. And uh, most everything, not eating out and that sort of thing. But I was really content, and nobody wanted to hear it because everybody was complaining about it at that time.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. So you're pretty introverted, but yet you're still really interested in co-living.
And as you'll see when I talk about what's going on now, I'm even more out there and cheerleading for co-living and bringing people together. I think another change is that the awareness of this, we refer to it as epidemic of loneliness, the awareness has grown significantly in the media. The US Surgeon General, I think it was last year, published an entire study and paper about it. And it is very common for me to read about it, not just as a single topic, but how this loneliness has permeated society. And I see it, because we're focused on it, we would see more of it than others, but I see it talked about everywhere. And uh, it is continuing, especially with young people and some of the despair and drug use of younger people and the opioid crisis. Um, so do you see that over in the UK as well? Are you seeing a lot more evidence of awareness of it, more as a political, social phenomenon than anybody doing anything practical about it?
Mhm.
What's your sense of that?
Yes, in the UK, I think there is an awareness of it at a political level. For a few years now, we've had a minister for loneliness. Um, and yeah, also at least one study on loneliness levels in the UK, if not more. And co-living and other forms of community-led housing have been linked with, ways to mitigate loneliness as well. So that link has been made. Um, and I think, as you said as well, maybe a few years ago, there was much more awareness that older people suffer from loneliness. So for quite a few years in the UK, there's been a service called the Silver Line, which, if you're an older person and you're feeling lonely or things are difficult, you have a phone number you can call and you can talk to somebody, a bit like the Samaritans. But I think in more recent years, the research has shown that actually a group of people very vulnerable to loneliness are young renters, which makes complete sense because as a young renter, you may be moving around, going to new places, you don't have those strong social ties. So I think more recently, attention has been paid to, the greater variety of people who can experience loneliness. And there are certainly campaigns to combat loneliness in the UK. And particularly around students as well who are, moving to university campuses, college campuses for the first time. Yeah, I think it's really tied into the attention paid to mental health and well-being. I think social connection and loneliness are part and parcel of that. So, it's still a big issue, but I think very positive that there's a lot more attention being paid to it now.
And I'm even seeing some foundation money I haven't gotten any of it, but I'm seeing evidence of more funding available for different, not co-living or co-housing in particular, but for programs to help with that. So, so where do you think we are in terms of the development of co-living, co-housing, since you would be one of the ones who would be most aware of what's going on just because of your continued focus? Does, part of the phenomenon of co-live that I think escaped us was that it was there was one person who was really spearheading it, and G, is that how he pronounced?
Yeah, Pedix.
And he left to pursue other things.
Well,
So,
he's still there. He's still there.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing as much activity as I did pre-COVID. But anyway, what's your sense of where things are? Are there new centers cropping up? And what's the state of it, and what does it look like now?
Yeah. So, gosh, where to start? Co-living there's several different models or several different versions of co-living. Co-living means different things to different people. So in the UK, there's a definite emphasis on large purpose-built co-living. So we're talking hundreds of residents in one building. And in the UK, co-living is really on the rise. And in many European cities, all over the world, really, in any place where there's a city where it's hard to come by affordable housing, where people want flexible and convenient places to live, and where social connection is a challenge, co-living is there. I guess probably not every city in the world, but in many big cities in the world, this is the case. So often it's quite large. There'll be hundreds of residents. There'll be large communal shared areas. So that's kind of one iteration of co-living that's really growing, and it's gained a lot of investor excitement, and a lot of investment in Europe has poured into this type of co-living. Then you have the kind of small digital nomad co-living spaces. So that's one which you don't get in the UK, or hardly ever, because digital nomads don't come to the UK for very good reasons. It's expensive and the weather isn't very good. And then you also have kind of smaller scale models. So in the UK, you might refer to that as HMO, houses of multiple occupation co-living. And that is effectively shared houses with this layer of, encouraging social connection, and also convenience as well. So that's another model. In a couple of countries, in France and Germany, there's been senior co-living set up, so co-living especially for older people. And then there's still some people who will use co-living as this kind of catch-all term for living together. So it gets applied to self-managed communities as well. So there's still a lot of different versions about what co-living is. But in general, I would say there's been a really huge rise in its numbers. And in particular, I've heard anecdotally in the UK in the last year or two, because of inflation and construction costs going up, co-living was one of the only viable development options out there, because from an investor perspective, it is so appealing. But having said that, we can't forget that co-living is still relatively tiny. So in the UK, I think the latest reports from Knight Frank said there's about 7,500 beds, which are currently open and in operation and with people living in them. And we have a pipeline of about a bit under double that, which, it's not nothing, but it's still tiny. So it's generally touted in the UK as a subsector of the build to rent sector. And people say the build to rent sector is really small. Co-living is just a tiny bit of the build to rent sector. So it's subsector of a subsector. It's still regarded as something quite new and quite exciting, I would say at this point. But I think it's definitely here to stay and it's going to grow.
Yeah, because housing is not going to become more affordable on its own. What about in the US? What do you hear about over here? My sense is that it's it's just not happening. Maybe in
Okay.
San Francisco, but what do you hear and what do
Okay.
you experience?
Yeah, I know less about the US market. So recently, the biggest US player, Common, uh, announced its bankruptcy, and that if you want to learn more about that, Guy Pedrix had an interview with the ex-CEO of Common, Brad Hargreaves, where he talks about what happened with Common. But I think to summarize, inflation costs got them. And also because they were expanding to different places so quickly, they didn't really have that the economies of scale when it came to operations. So if you have, if you have lots of co-living sites in one city, then that makes running those sites more efficient because you can share in maintenance crew, supply chains, etc., etc. But if you have kind of one here, one there, one here, one there, you don't have that same efficiency. So yeah, I think mainly a combination of those two things got them. Having said that, I mean, co-living is present in the US. We recently worked with Outpost, which is, I think, mainly based in New York in the US, and they're doing really well. They're going strong, and I know there are plenty of other operators as well. But I couldn't really give you a good take on what the US co-living sector is like.
Sure. Um, you know, the largest co-working space, WeWork, went under financial difficulties, I think probably right around the time of COVID, and it's a shell of what it used to be. Do you think, and I think a lot of them, especially during COVID, went under. Uh, there are still some, and I'm seeing some here in my local area. But do you think a dip was there a dip in co-working spaces, and was that reflected in what may have been going on with co-living and co-housing too?
Oh, yeah, I'm interested in what's happening with co-working spaces because on the one hand, you have more and more people working from home. So office spaces in general, I think, have suffered. But having said that, the WeWork model, the kind of hire a desk or hire a meeting room, that actually there may be quite a few companies who are transitioning to those kinds of spaces instead. So possibly that kind of model might benefit from that cultural shift. But yeah, I couldn't tell you what's happening with the kind of WeWork model at the moment. I do know that in central London, there's lots of office spaces and people are wondering, what are we going to do with all these spaces that we no longer need? And something like co-living, I think, is a really great solution in terms of converting buildings. But having said that, often there's big practical barriers to doing that because offices often have these very deep floor plates. And so how do you actually create spaces that will be pleasant and good enough for people to live in, considering that not every room would have a window, right? So
Yeah,
that and other challenges means that it's great in theory, but tricky in practice.
yeah. Getting water, sewage removal,
Yeah.
uh, it's really difficult in some of those buildings.
Mhm.
Um, the WeWork phenomenon ran into the same problems that um, office space in general did, where there was a lot of financing at near zero interest rates. And then here and probably across Europe too, the interest rate skyrocketed to 5, 6, 7%. And, the whole office space business is in jeopardy and could implode, explode any moment. What about, I'm in Florida in the US, and I really feel the right wing tilt politically. I moved from a red state to an even redder state in Florida. And there are right wing movements aplenty in Europe as well. I generally associate co-living as a left-leaning concept. There is a practical level where it's not really left or right. It's just practical. But I do think it's people who lean left that focus more on community, whereas here in the US especially, we have this frontier mentality where we have a value on fierce independence, and competitiveness, which sort of conflicts with community. So do you sense that the rightward tilt of many countries has negatively affected co-living?
Wow, what an interesting question. So in the UK, we're a little bit anomalous. We've had a tilt to the left. So in July, we elected a Labour government. Having said that, we've recently had some riots which have had this kind of far right element to them. So I think we haven't escaped the trend that we've seen in Europe. So I think co-living as it is in the UK, I think it's fairly posited as more of a kind of consumer experience with a bit of kind of community ethos and sharing mindset, rather than a really strong message of communalism. So I don't think it has that a particularly strong kind of, it's not that politically loaded. That's my interpretation. I do think that because of the age demographic that tends to live in co-living, which does tend to be sort of late 20s, mid 30s, the likelihood is that people who live in co-living will be more left-leaning, because certainly in the UK, there's a very strong age divide, that older people tend to be more conservative, the equivalent of Republican in the US, younger people, more Labour, the equivalent of Democrat. However, what you're saying about political leanings and community mindedness, certainly in the community-led housing sector, so in co-housing or people who live in old converted mansions together as a community, absolutely, yes, it's very normal for them to be very, very left-leaning and quite politically active and motivated as well. So I definitely do acknowledge that trend exists, but I don't know how it plays out in co-living. But yeah, to answer your question, I think that my prediction is, it's not really informed by any data or research. I don't think a lean to the right would really negatively impact co-living. And I think that the cost of housing and finding suitable housing is such, it's so present as a difficulty, that actually there are plenty of people who would appreciate co-living even if not from the community perspective, just from the housing perspective, really.
Right.
But what is your sense?
I am, well, like I said, I'm in a very right-wing, politically charged. We're certainly in that era, and I'm in a location in Florida, that in mid-sized city, where I feel it, and I feel it around me, um, with some of these older people that are also more traditional. I think in my particular community, and I'm sort of tiptoeing around it. Um, I felt like, we've got a political pushback, right versus left, on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in our mission statement for Thrive, we intentionally put inclusive in there. And I think it's a dirty word amongst some people. Um, so I'm just sort of tiptoeing around it. I'm not, I'm watching some of the terminology in our publicity, and I'm definitely feeling isolated, but we're slowly growing. Maybe this is a good time for me to tell you what happened with our initiative during COVID and beyond.
That'd be great.
So during COVID, I kept looking for properties because the original concept was to build a community from the ground up, focusing on multi-generational inclusion and sustainability. And I found several properties. This one will tickle you. One of them was a big church property, maybe 7 acres, 8 acres, could be 10. And it had a big church building. And then it had a huge parking lot where we could use the church building for activities. It even had a really high ceiling in the sanctuary. And I had witnessed another Mennonite church in where I used to live that had high ceilings, and they didn't have built-in pews. They just brought folding chairs in, and they played volleyball there in the sanctuary during the week. And I thought, man, that's a church I could belong to. They've got their priorities straight. But anyway, it had a high ceiling light where we could play volleyball. Um, I found, the irony of that one is the name of that church was St. Mark's. And I didn't need any encouragement for a Messiah complex. So I thought it might not, and it didn't work out. But I had found several properties. And because real estate was going so fast during COVID, before I could do due diligence and find out what the economics would be, the property sold. So 2 or 3. And I decided I would not try to build a master plan and recruit people before I found the property. So it just was not working. So in the meantime, my partner and I and her son, uh, living here in Tampa Bay, those that are familiar, Clearwater, Florida, which is a very popular beach area, is the closest that I can describe where we live. And so I moved into a condo complex. There are 186 units. They are all 1 story. They're connected 3 to 5 in a sharing walls. Every property is either on a lake or the golf course, which is typical and it was built in the early 1980s. And spread out, I don't know how many acres, but they're all 1 story, so it's not densely populated. And here, all new residential construction is 4 to 5 story apartment buildings. Maybe they have a gym, maybe they have a pool. They have a laundry facility, but very little co-living going on. Every person is going right into their unit and watching their own big screen TV, and very, very little going on that's cooperative. So I was sitting out back, and I live right on the lake. In fact, I'm sitting at my desk. I've got a monitor here, my computer here, and I'm looking at a bird feeder and the lake right outside my door. And I love to sit out on the lake. And one night I was sitting out, the weather was beautiful, moon was out, and I was just contemplating what I was going to do about Thrive. And I thought, man, why don't I just do it here? We've got a company, an office supply company, Staples, that has as an advertising meme to hit the easy button. It's a little red button. Hit the easy button by buying from us. And I thought, why don't I hit the easy button? Uh, there are 186 people here, families here, 90% 55 and older. Some would be interested in sustainability, probably not the majority. Some would be interested, or like just the odds are, some would be interested in shared activities and communal activities. So why not just do it here? And suddenly I was so relieved because I didn't have all of the construction, all the weight of all of that. And you probably don't know this, but I built my own home back in the 80s out in the country. Uh, I had a hand on every board. I did it all except for finishing the drywall. And so I realized I've really had enough of that. I still have that property and someone is living on it, but it was a real relief. And what my main interest has been throughout was the community organizing, the neighborhood organizing of events that would bring people together. And I thought, I can easily do that here. Now, we don't have a large common building. We have a pool shelter that's probably, I don't know my meters, my metrics, but probably 20 feet by 20 feet. So divide that by 3. So there's not easy accommodations to bring people together, but we've had a wine tasting event where people brought bottles of wine in a brown paper sack, and so that nobody knew what the wine was, and we tasted different wines. We had it marked on where they got it, where they purchased it, and then at the end we unveiled all the bottles of wine and flipped over the card, and it said how much it was so we could see how expensive our wine tastes were. And then we also had an artist who displayed some of his artwork, an abstract artist. And we had maybe 30 people in one of the residences. And we've had lectures about different topics, pet care. We've got what I'm calling a community conversation with 2 residents, one who had been a commercial pilot and the other who is really into fitness. And they're going to divide an hour and talk about that over breakfast at a nearby restaurant. We had a kayaking. There's a lot of crystal clear spring-fed rivers in the area. And we had a kayaking event planned. We had hurricane warnings and tropical storm that postponed it. But we've had a lot of activities. We've got a core group that's interested, and we'll put leaflets out and invite other people. We haven't really made a dent in awareness, but we've only been doing it since January.
So fantastic.
So, and if people want to check it out, I'll go ahead and plug the website. If you go to Thrive Co-Living Communities and click the button for Quail Forest, that's the name of this local community, or just type in thrivequailforest.org. Let's see, it's thrivecolivingcommunities.org or thrivequailforest.org. You'll see the activities. We're still doing podcasts. And I am sort of downplaying the left-leaning language, and just talking about let's get together. And we had a carry-out pizza afternoon at the pool. Bring your favorite carry-out pizza and your favorite game. We did board games.
That's
So,
great. And Mark, do you think that you could have done this in any suburban neighborhood or anywhere that you lived, or was there something particular about where you live now that meant it was easy to get this core group together?
because it is one HOA community, I think that brings some cohesion. There are lots of those communities here in the area. So, but I think it makes a natural demarcation so that if it was just a neighborhood that wasn't, and there's limited access, it's not gated or it's not locked down, but it's limited access. So it sort of has a defining boundary that can bring some camaraderie. So I don't think if it was in a suburban neighborhood that it would work as well as it does here. We also have a lot of seniors. So, and just to fill out the page, I am looking at some software that would allow us to do some of those community things that were on our original list, giving away items free that we no longer want, recycling those, sharing our skills with each other on a barter hour by hour basis, sharing tools so that everybody doesn't have to have a weed eater. And so I found some software that looks promising called Share Tribe that, and I think people could even sell items between themselves. So I've got that planned, and we applied for a grant with a community foundation. We didn't get it the first round. We're applying again in October to provide services like Meals on Wheels, transportation, checking in on seniors around health and doing some programming around health. So there is some money available locally, and we're going to seek that and seek to provide some more services, concrete services for seniors. So
fantastic.
I still think we're developing a model, but it's certainly different from what I had envisioned. But it's much more manageable. We're doing an activity a month, an event per month. It's certainly more manageable than starting a community from scratch.
Indeed. Yeah. And you know what, as well, it's probably more replicable too, because there's going to be a lot of neighborhoods like this with a similar setup where you just need the process and you need a few motivated individuals. And why not? That kind of thing can be replicated. And how did you find kind of seeking out people and getting it going and finding a core group of people who were interested? How did you do that?
Well, one of the reasons that I chose to do this was that everyone was so welcoming. We've been here a little over a year, and I probably met the dog people first because we're all out and our dogs are socializing. But I just naturally met people that were like-minded and very welcoming and embracing. And, I put it out there. Our first event was a bowling event, and there was one other couple that came. But they were so enthused about community. So it's just been, and that's probably the best way to start something like this, is just organically letting it come together, trying to diversify the leadership and getting other people to take on some of that initiative, which is starting to happen. So
yeah, oh, that's fantastic. I'm really pleased for you. That sounds great.
and it's just what I really needed. And if I had gotten St. Mark's, I would have been way over my head, because I still do have a business to run. So, well, oops. So let's start to wrap up a little bit. What are your hopes and dreams? What's your vision for where this can go and what it can do?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the benefits of co-living and other types of shared living are really clear. You're sharing, so you're using less resources, and you're also more connected with people, so there's less loneliness, and there's all of those benefits you get from sharing your lives more closely with others. And so I think for me, the dream is that co-living and some other forms of shared living, such as co-housing, for example, become really normal. In the UK, I guess that's my personal take because that's where I live, but anywhere and everywhere, become normal and become accessible as well. So that if you want to do it, it's not an exclusive thing that's either really expensive or really scarce in terms of supply. It's really viable. And I think on that note, with the situation we're in with the climate crisis, it's likely that we will over time have to share more things together. So I think let's learn how to share and let's appreciate sharing and let's share things well. And I think that is something that co-living and forms of shared living can help us to do and can help us to learn how to do as well. So yeah, for me, it's about sharing well.
Are there some of these co-housing, co-living communities that will invite people to come in on a very short-term basis, a week, even a long weekend, where more people could get a taste of what it's like? Could be a good way to travel, especially in Europe. What do you find there? Is there openness to that, or do they really want long-term renters there?
So there are spaces especially designed for digital nomads, so people who are traveling a lot and they don't have a job which ties them to a space. And there, I think it's normal to stay for a short amount of time. I don't know about a long weekend, but certainly 1 or 2 weeks. There are also co-living spaces that are larger, that are kind of hybrid hotel co-living. So you can stay literally for a night if you want to, or for longer if you wish as well. And then there's some co-living spaces where minimum tenancy is 3 months. So it is a bit longer term. And then also if you want something less, where you're less of a customer and more of a real community participant, you can go to organizations such as WOOF, which I think stands for something like Weekend Work on Organic Farms. So you can visit communities as a volunteer, you can take part in communal life, and you can help with doing a few chores and some work in the gardens in exchange for your bed and board. And then there's also kind of retreats and eco villages where you're visiting as a holiday, but you're kind of being given a wonderful experience of which community living is a part. So there's lots of different ways to engage with co-living and other forms of shared living. So in particular, I'd recommend the websites WOOF, WWOOF. I'd also recommend Diggers and Dreamers if you're in the UK. That has a list of UK intentional communities. And also our own website, consciouscoliving.com. That's worth a visit. We've got quite a few free resources, including some guidance on how to find different co-living spaces too.
Great. And that was, you beat me to the punch. I was going to ask you how people could best reach out to you. So say the website again, and if you want to give your email address or other contact information.
Yeah, so our website is consciouscoliving.com. That's all one word. And there you'll find a bunch of resources, including our own podcast too. I think worth checking out. And then our email address is connect@consciouscoliving.com. So yeah, if you're interested, feel free to drop us a message.
Great. Would you put me on your email list for the podcast so that I can tune in regularly? And our podcast can be found at thrivecolivingcommunities.org, cleverly labeled podcasts up at the top of the page. And we're doing these about once a week. So, Penny, it was great to reconnect with you. It always feels good when you have a fellow traveler who shares some of your values and hopes and dreams to be able to talk about it. I'm sorry I was in a cave the whole time. And I have no idea why it happened. But anyway, I want to thank you so much for being back, and let's be sure to reconnect um, at shorter intervals than what
Yeah.
we've done this time. And I sure thank you for your work, your enthusiasm, your vision, and you have been a leader in the field for quite a few years. And it takes people like that to help spread it. So thank you for that and for being on the podcast. And everybody, thanks for being with us here on the Thrive Co-Living Communities podcast. If you liked the episode, and hopefully you did, be sure to do a thumbs up, click subscribe, and click that notification bell to be alerted on new episodes. So we'll see you again. Penny, thanks again for being with us.
Thanks so
And
much. Real pleasure. And yeah, congrats on all the progress as well. Sounds brilliant.
great. Thanks, everybody. See you next time. Thanks for joining us for another great episode of the Thrive Co-Living Communities YouTube podcast. To learn more about our mission and how you can support our vision of creating co-living communities worldwide, please visit us at thrivecolivingcommunities.org. To receive advanced viewings of our podcast and other exclusive content, find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Thrive Co-Living Communities. You can also learn more ways to support our mission in the show notes below. Amazon Smile, GoFundMe, Kroger, and our own Thrive Gear store, where you can buy t-shirts, hats, and many other items. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.